Hello again. My name's Ian Boyd. I work for ARC, Biodiversity and Climate. And for the past 14 or 15 months, we've been working with the Isle of Wight Council and a whole range of other organisations and individuals, land management organisations, community organisations, educational organisations, many other people working on and for the island to develop the Isle of Wight's local nature recovery strategy, the LNRS. And if you've seen the earlier videos, you'll have an understanding of what that means. These are new legal statutory documents. They are spatial plans for nature recovery, for wildlife, for species and habitats. That look at where we can go next. So, what have we already got that's good? Where do we go next in terms of extending value for wildlife, recovering biodiversity on the Isle of Wight? How do we do that? Where do we focus our attention for the next 3 to 5 years, which is the first iteration of the LNRS? And then there'll be a review, see what's worked, what hasn't worked, and move on to the next stage of LNRS, looking at different areas potentially, or reinforcing the work in the areas that have already been successful and productive for wildlife. Now, we've had a look at LNRSs in general. We've had a look at the description of the project area, which is, of course, the whole of the Isle of Wight and its intertidal areas. We've had a look at the priorities and measures document 2, which is the real detail and runs alongside the interactive map that you'll have had a chance, I hope, to explore. You can access all of these through the consultation process from this website. So what we're going to do, just briefly, in this video is look at documents 3 and 4. Now, we're just going to look at document 4. It's exactly the same information as document 3, just differently arranged. And this is where the species information is held. So document 3 is literally an alphabetical list of all of the priority species that have been identified by specialists, as well as by the general public, species that are important to them, that have value to them, that they want to see included in the priority list. Now, that doesn't mean to say that the other species aren't of importance. It simply means that these are the ones that carry the weight for a lot of other species. If we do the right thing for this species or this group of species, and we'll talk about that in a minute, then we're going to be carrying an awful lot of other wildlife with us. And it makes it a manageable number. Now, document 4 does exactly the same thing, but it groups those species into what are called assemblages. And you can see that in the title of the document. Assemblages are species that have something in common. So they need the same kind of habitat requirements. There may be a relationship between those species. There may be what are called interdependencies in the way that these species actually work together. So they don't just share the need for certain kind of habitat resources. They may actually work alongside one another to create the right kind of outcomes for them in their life cycles. So these are really valuable. They're groups of species that we can begin to look at and think, well, what can we do for all of these at once that bring with them a whole load of other species? What habitats does that relate to? So that's the information given in here. We're just going to quickly look through some of the document, but of course, you've got time to explore all of this in greater detail and give your thoughts and opinions on how useful it is, how readable it is, and if it's covering the right kind of areas in your opinion and in your experience. And all of that feedback is tremendously important, invaluable in making sure that we get the right document for the next 3 to 5 years. So let's just have a quick scroll through. A little bit of introduction about species on the Isle of Wight. And you'll have seen some of this information in the other documents too. In the description of the Isle of Wight, there's a whole section on species as well. The number of officially recorded species on the island through what's called the local record centre, the local biological record centre, most counties have these, is about 10,000. The number that are recorded in the wider network of experts working in particular species groups, what are called taxonomic groups, maybe as high as 15,000. That's an awful lot. And the process of the last year and a half has been going through all of that information, trying to settle on the right one. And there's a methodology, and you can find all of the technical information on how evidence and method has been used to select these species in the technical appendix, that's document 5, and in many of the references throughout these documents. So please do explore those. And if you have any questions, then the consultation questionnaire gives you room to ask questions about why this species, why not that species, and we can make sure that those are properly covered. So we've ended up with a list of 485 priority species. That's still a long list, but it's a lot more manageable than 10,000. And these are grouped into 14 habitat assemblages where there's some thematic or ecological or ecosystem connection between those, so that if we do the right kind of actions, we'll bring the whole of that bundle, that assemblage of species forward. We'll be able to deliver nature recovery for a whole group of species all at once. Now, you'll notice, I'm sure, that the assemblages, when we look through them, are not necessarily the same as the habitat descriptions that we've got in document 2. So where we talk about trees and woodlands, or we talk about catchments and rivers, they're not necessarily exactly the same names for these species assemblages. And there's a really good reason for that. And that is that the assemblages and groups of habitats that have been pulled together as the priorities for action are really coming from what's called a macro scale, looking at the whole of the Isle of Wight landscape, its geology, its physical geography, its chemistry, its landscape and ecology, and working out what are the groups of habitats based on their vegetation and on their soils and on their geology that make the most sense to pull together. So we're working from a very large scale down to a medium scale. It's the other way around with species, where we start with individual species and their very precise and particular requirements, and the individual places that we know that they're found on the island. And in some cases, that is quite literally one rock. So for some of the rarest small plants that we have, non-flowering plants like bryophytes, it may literally be a single boulder where they're found. But for others, it's particular types of what are called niches. So not a whole-scale habitat, but a particular kind of micro-habitat within that might be important. Or they may need several different habitats during the course of their life cycle. Think about butterflies. Their caterpillars need very different environments in many ways to their adults. So caterpillars are going to need plenty of foliage, maybe of a very particular kind. The adults really just need access to nectar. They may prefer some flowers to others simply because of access to nectar, but they're going to be much more mobile as well. Of course, they'll travel much longer distances. So all of those things, starting from the bottom up, bring us to the level of species assemblages, but they don't map perfectly over habitats, and that's really, really important. Otherwise, we're going to end up simplifying things too much and missing matters of importance. So groups of habitats may include several species assemblages. And we saw that when we were talking about the last document, where a woodland may include some wetland habitats, some grassland habitats, some heathland habitats. So that wooded environment that's covered in the priorities and measures may actually import a number of different kinds of species assemblage. And this nested approach makes sure that we get maximum flexibility in the way that we think about doing the right things for nature recovery. So that's just an explanation as to how that works. Okay. So first bit of this document 4 allows you to go to the assemblages of species and to read across into the priorities and measures, into the different codes that are all listed out in document 2. So it's a kind of shorthand. So if you want to, you can start here, species, look at things that are of interest to you, read across and find the codes for the relevant measures that you can find on the map and in document 2, and then explore it that way. Or you can go to those sites first and work your way back down to species. So the whole point of the LNRS in the way that it's produced is that you can come at it from almost any point and explore all of the different aspects that it then covers. Okay. So that's a shorthand way of linking species assemblages to the different kinds of priorities and measures. There's an awful lot of that. We won't dwell on that. Chance to explore that at your leisure in your own time. But we then get to the individual assemblages, and we'll just have a look at a couple of these so you can get a feel for how these are written. So in each case, the species assemblage, and there are 14 that have been identified by starting with specialists and long species lists and working our way down to a short manageable list, a shorter manageable list, and then identifying within that how these species click together in areas that we can identify and really focus on the work in those areas, and how we can take those assemblages and stick them alongside and within the kinds of habitat and landscape priorities that have also been identified. Okay. So in each case, there'll be the name of the assemblage and then a short summary of what that is saying. So what kinds of habitats are within that species assemblage? What are the key features that we need to think about? What are the life cycle resources, we might say, that species are relying upon in that area? And then it will give you the list of species that go with that habitat. So here we are in trees and woodlands. And then written alphabetically, just for ease of access, there will be all of the priority species from that list. Remember, 485 species, all of the key ones from that 485 species that relate to trees and woodlands, that have something in common, that are reliant on features that they share, maybe work together as their own mini assemblages. And we'll look at some of those in a moment, where they share, for example, a common food plant that's found in this particular kind of habitat. Now, you'll see that some of these are in bold. And these are nominated champion species. Now, the idea here, and there's about 160, 170 of those. So again, it's a shorter list. The idea of these is that these are species that are perhaps more familiar. They may actually be unfamiliar. Alcatho bat, for example, is not a very familiar one, but it's a very interesting one. But by focusing on this next level down, again, we can maybe undertake projects, think about actions, and programs of work that are really focused quite narrowly on that species. But we know that in doing so, it will improve a habitat for most of the other things, or many of the other things, in that same assemblage. So champions help us to talk about it as well. So we can pick these champion species, we can do some publicity work on it, we can do some educational work on it. So rather than trying to deal with every single one of the 485, some of which are quite obscure, all deeply fascinating nonetheless, we've got a shorter list of ones that help us to communicate stories about species within the LNRS, and the kind of actions that all of us can help to undertake to support their long-term futures. And you'll see that we've tried again to make sure that different taxonomic groups are covered. So it's not just all birds, it's not just all mammals, it's not just all flowering plants. We've got fungi, bryophytes, lichens, all sorts of perhaps lesser known groups are included within not only the 485, but the champion species too, so that we can really get a sense of the breadth of biodiversity that the island has, which is extraordinarily rich. And we can begin to learn how we can manage spaces and places to benefit the widest range of biology, of biodiversity that we can. So you'll see as we read down, it tells you the Latin name. Again, that can be useful if we're doing research work, or if people are trying to find other sources of information, other references. The common name or English name. And then what is it? Is it a fungus? Is it a flowering plant? Is it a non-flowering plant? What actually is it? So that literally just gives you the full list. And each of these you will also find referenced in document 2. So if you remember, there are columns of broader environmental benefits, ecosystem service benefits, and species benefits alongside those priorities and measures in document 2. So again, you can work from that document down to these species lists, or from the species list back up to that document. So we've got red squirrel, we've got wonderful things like the Satan's bolete, an extraordinary woodland fungus. We've got bats, we've got butterflies, beautiful white admiral, wonderful woodland butterfly. And each of these has some kind of requirement for habitat improvement. They're species that are maybe suffering declines, or species which are requiring a habitat resource that is diminishing, where we can genuinely take action. And again, this is really super important for the LNRS, that over the next 3 to 5 years, we're identifying practical, deliverable actions for nature recovery in the right places, for the right species, to get the right results, to achieve measurable improvements for nature recovery and biodiversity. And you'll have a chance, of course, by looking through all of these documents, to give us your opinion on that. Do you think these are the right species? Do you think these are the right places? Completely legitimate concerns and questions and ideas and proposals, particularly because there will be a further iteration of this document. This document will become a second version after 3 to 5 years, where everything we've learned about what's worked and what hasn't gets applied, along with all of your comments and suggestions. And of course, in that period, we'll be working with so many different organisations. Anyone has a chance to get involved in this, in your garden, in your school, in the place you work, on your farm, in your parish, wherever it may be. There's information in here that can help you to pinpoint something of interest and to focus your attention on delivering benefits for it. And that's the whole point of the LNRS. Okay, so we'll have a look. Let's just scroll down and find, being very selfish, my own favourite assemblage, which is bogs. Now, these are small peaty wetlands, and I don't know if you've seen the early videos, but we did mention in passing that one of the things the island is particularly important for is deep peat deposits. Now, peat in the south of England tends to be quite shallow. They're called basin peats in the New Forest, for example. On the island, we do have shallow peats, but we also have really deep peats that go down 20, 30 feet. And within those peat beds, there's a complete pollen record in some cases, right the way back to the Ice Age. So 10, 11, 12,000 years of vegetation history. These are extraordinary, irreplaceable resources, not just scientific resources, but cultural resources. And on the surface of these peat areas, many of them are in very poor condition, but have the scope to be recovered. That's the whole point of nature recovery. Or they are in wonderful condition, but they're vulnerable to change, water quality, habitat loss, climate change. But the bog assemblage has some absolutely spectacular species in it, and we'll just pick out some of them. Pale butterwort is a beautiful little flower. It's only found on one site on the island, the marvellous Bohemia bog. It's an insectivorous plant. Quite a few of the plants on these nutrient poor peat soils have to supplement their diet by catching insects. There's just not enough in the soil to support them. So we have sundews and we have butterworts, both of which catch insects and feed on them. We've got an amazing number of mosses. You'll have heard of sphagnum mosses, or there are 6 or 7 really important rare species of sphagnum on the island, mainly found in these bogs. That we can find ways of protecting. So we know if we've got a really healthy community of sphagnum bogs on a site, there'll be a whole load of other stuff that's benefiting too. So you can begin to get the idea of champion species and assemblages. We know that if we focus on these visible things and improvements for these visible species, that there's uplift for the whole set happening, even though we may find it harder to measure some of those indicators. So a whole load of absolutely wonderful and scarce plants found in the island bogs. So that's another really good example of a key assemblage. Now, those may find a place in catchments and wetlands. There may be features of bog-like habitats in soft cliffs. There may be some features of some of these kind of habitats in woodlands. So again, you can see how some of these assemblages may overlap with different kinds of habitats. And that gives us maximum opportunity to focus our attention for nature recovery. So that's a very quick introduction to species assemblages. Have a look at document 3 as well, which is the full list, all 485 in alphabetical order, so you get a sense of the full range of species that we're looking at. It includes intertidal and marine species as well. And it includes freshwater species. So there's a very important group of fish included. And I think we've mentioned this in an earlier video, the fish that move between estuarine saltwater conditions, freshwater river conditions, these migratory species. And that automatically links a whole bunch of habitats around estuaries and ports with river systems. So you can see how an assemblage may cross between different kinds of habitat groups. So I'm going to stop sharing at that point. I hope that's been useful to you. Do have an explore. In many ways, it's the most interesting bit of the LNRS, is to explore the species and really get to know them. Pick out your own favourites, things that you're familiar with, things that you love to see yourself. And give us your comments and thoughts in this consultation phase about what you think about the species selected and what you would like to see done to support their populations on the island, so that together we can work for nature recovery across the Isle of Wight and achieve great results, not just for habitats and species, but for all of us. Okay, thanks very much, and we'll leave it there.